Racist waitress dumps trash on black family's table. Not knowing they own the franchise, a family's dinner is disrupted by an act of hatred. The waitress, blinded by her biases, is unaware her actions could cost her more than her job. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Jessica balanced 3 plates on her forearm, weaving between tables at Carter's family restaurant. Her black uniform was spotted with various stains from the lunch rush, and her feet ached in the mandatory non-slip shoes. 8 hours into her shift, she'd already dealt with a customer who insisted his well-done steak was too dry and another who complained about the prices being higher than they were 5 years ago. The restaurant operated like most family establishments in town, a steady stream of regulars mixed with tourists, serving traditional American comfort food. Jessica had worked there for 3 years, taking the job right after high school when her plans for college fell through due to financial constraints. Now at 21, she spent her breaks scrolling through online courses on her phone, dreaming of a career in graphic design. Table 6 needs their check, called out Marco, another server, as he rushed past with a coffee pot. Jessica nodded, adding it to her mental checklist. She learned to keep track of multiple tasks simultaneously. Refills for table 3, extra napkins for table 8, and now the check for 6. The bell above the door chimed, signaling new customers. Through the entrance came a well-dressed black family, a man in a tailored suit, a woman in business attire, and what appeared to be the man's sister in artistic casual wear. Jessica noticed the staff's subtle reactions, the slight pause in conversations, the quick glances. It wasn't often they saw black customers in suits in this part of town. What no one else knew yet was that this was the Carter family, the restaurant's new owners. They purchased the establishment from old Mr. Peterson, who was retiring after 30 years. They chose a table near the window, their excitement evident in their animated conversation and wide smiles. David Carter pointed at various spots in the restaurant, likely discussing future renovations with his wife and sister. His sister, Mia, pulled out a small sketchbook, quickly jotting down notes and making rough drawings. They represented hope for the aging establishment, new energy, new ideas, and a fresh perspective. Jessica approached their table with menus, maintaining her professional demeanor. "Welcome to Peterson's," she said, not yet aware of the ownership change. "I'm Jessica, and I'll be your server today." The next few minutes proceeded normally. Jessica took their drink orders and returned with 3 waters with lemon. The Carters continued their discussion, occasionally asking questions about the restaurant's history and regular customers. Jessica answered politely, still unaware of their connection to the establishment. The incident happened during the dinner rush. Jessica, carrying a busbin full of dirty dishes and food waste, turned too quickly to avoid a running child. Her grip slipped. In slow motion, she watched as the bin's contents, half-eaten burgers, used napkins, and various condiment-soaked waste, spilled directly onto the Carters' table, splattering their clothes and interrupting their meal. The restaurant fell silent. The clattering of utensils ceased. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Every eye turned toward the scene. Jessica stood frozen, her hands still gripping the empty bin, as food waste dripped from the table onto Mr. Carter's suit pants. Mrs. Carter's white blouse now bore a large ketchup stain, and Mia's sketchbook was soaked with soda. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Jessica's mind raced with the implications. Not just the mess, not just tea. He ruined clothes, but the optics of a white server dumping garbage on a black family in a predominantly white neighborhood. Her face burned with embarrassment and horror at what she'd done, regardless of its accidental nature. The moment hung suspended in time, a single mistake about to cascade into consequences none of them could yet imagine. David Carter stood up slowly, napkin dropping from his lap to the floor. His suit, custom-tailored and worn for this special occasion of visiting their new business investment, was stained with food waste. The restaurant remained silent as he locked eyes with Jessica, who still hadn't moved from her spot. "Would you care to explain what just happened?" His voice was controlled but tense, carrying across the quiet dining room. Other customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some pulling out phones to record the confrontation. Jessica's mouth opened and closed several times before words came out. "I'm so sorry, sir. I turned too quickly and the bin just—" Her explanation trailed off as she noticed Mrs. Carter attempting to salvage her blouse with a handful of napkins. Tom Mitchell, the restaurant manager, emerged from the kitchen. He assessed the scene with visible discomfort, his eyes darting between Jessica and the Carters. As a middle-aged white man who'd managed the restaurant for 15 years, he'd never faced a situation quite like this. "Mr. Carter, please allow me to handle this situation," Tom said, finally approaching the table. His use of their name caused Jessica's eyes to widen as realization hit. These weren't just customers. They were the new owners. David Carter raised his hand, cutting off Tom's practiced manager speech. "Handle it? Like you handled the hiring and training of staff who think it's acceptable to dump garbage on paying customers?" The question hung in the air, loaded with implications. "It was an accident," Jessica interjected, her voice shaking. "I would never intentionally dash, intentional or not," Mrs. Carter spoke up, her voice firm but calmer than her husband's. "This reflects poorly on the establishment's standards. We just invested a considerable sum in this restaurant, and this is our welcome." Mia Carter, who had been quietly observing, placed a hand on her brother's arm. "David, maybe we should discuss this in private." She gestured toward the growing number of phone cameras pointed their way. The Carters huddled together, speaking in hushed tones while Tom led Jessica away from the table. In his office, Tom paced back and forth, running his hands through his graying hair. "Jessica, do you understand the position you've put me in? The Carters just bought this place. They could demand I fire you on the spot." Tom's words carried the weight of 15 years of careful management, now potentially undone by one incident. Meanwhile, the Carter family's discussion grew more intense. "We can't let this go," David insisted. "Not after everything we've dealt with trying to buy this place. The whispers about whether we belong in this neighborhood." Mia leaned forward, her artist's perspective seeing beyond the immediate conflict. "Then don't let it go, David. But maybe this is exactly what we needed, a catalyst for change. This incident, as unfortunate as it is, could be turned into something meaningful." Mrs. Carter nodded slowly, wiping her hands with a clean napkin. "She's right. We bought this place knowing we'd face challenges. Instead of just demanding the girl's job, we could use this as an opportunity to address the larger issues at play." The family's conversation shifted from anger to purpose. They began discussing ways to transform this unfortunate incident into a platform for dialogue about unconscious bias and systemic prejudice in their community. David stood up, straightening his stained jacket. "Tom," he called out, his voice carrying across the restaurant. "We need to speak with you and Jessica. Now!" The tension in Tom's office could be cut with a knife as the Carters entered. Jessica stood against the wall, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Tom sat behind his desk, looking years older than he had that morning. "We've made a decision," David announced. "This incident cannot and will not be ignored. However, our response might surprise you." The Carters laid out their proposal. Instead of immediate termination or public shaming, they wanted to use this incident as a teachable moment, not just for Jessica, but for the entire community. It was a decision that would set in motion events none of them could have anticipated. Mia sat in her studio apartment, surrounded by canvases and art supplies. The incident at the restaurant had sparked something in her, an artistic vision she couldn't ignore. She began sketching faces, each one telling a different story of discrimination. A woman being followed in a store, a man being passed over for promotion, a child being told they couldn't play with others. Her brushes moved with purpose across the canvas, creating stark images that captured moments of prejudice in everyday life. The centerpiece of her work featured a split scene. On one side, the restaurant incident with Jessica and the garbage. On the other, a transformation showing hands reaching across the divide. While Mia worked, Jessica sat alone in her small apartment on the other side of town. The weight of her actions pressed down on her shoulders. She'd spent hours reading news articles about racial bias, watching documentaries about systemic racism, trying to understand the larger context of what had happened. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from coworkers. Some offered support. Others suggested she quit before things got worse. A few local news outlets had already picked up the story, with grainy cell phone footage of the incident circulating online. The community center buzzed with activity as David and Mia presented their idea for an art exhibition. They stood before the local arts council, explaining their vision for a show that would combine Mia's artwork with interactive installations about prejudice and personal growth. "We want to create a space where people can confront their own biases," David explained to the council members. "The incident at our restaurant showed us how much work still needs to be done in our community." Several council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One spoke up, "Are you sure this is the right time? This could stir up unnecessary tension." Mia stepped forward, pulling up images of her work on her tablet. "Tension already exists. We're just making it visible." She scrolled through her sketches, showing how each piece connected to real experiences in their community. The meeting drew others from the neighborhood. Word had spread about the restaurant incident, and people wanted to know how the new business owners would respond. Some supported the idea of an exhibition, seeing it as a chance for meaningful dialogue. Others worried it would damage the community's reputation. As the discussion continued, Mia noticed patterns emerging in people's reactions. Those who'd faced discrimination themselves understood immediately, while others struggled to see why an accident needed to become a larger conversation about race. Back in her studio, Mia worked late into the night, adding details to her paintings. She included subtle references to historical civil rights movements, connecting past struggles to present challenges. Her art style evolved, becoming more confrontational while maintaining an underlying message of hope and potential for change. Jessica, still grappling with her role in all of this, found herself researching local civil rights history. She discovered that the restaurant's building had once been a segregated establishment in the 1960s. This knowledge added another layer of significance to what had happened. The community's response continued to grow. Local artists reached out to me, offering to contribute their own works about discrimination. Teachers asked about bringing their students to learn from the exhibition. Even some initial skeptics began to see the value in addressing these issues openly. As the project gained momentum, David met with community leaders to secure additional support. He emphasized that this wasn't about shame or blame, but about growth and understanding. Some leaders pledged their support, while others remained hesitant, worried about potential backlash. The transformation of an accidental slight into a catalyst for community dialogue was taking shape. Through Mia's art and David's advocacy, what could have been just another instance of racial tension was becoming something more, a chance for real change. The restaurant's atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Jessica felt the cold shoulders from co-workers who once shared jokes with her during breaks. At the coffee station, conversation stopped when she approached. Some servers refused to cover her sections, claiming they were too busy. "You need to make this right," Marco told her during a slow afternoon shift. "A public apology, something formal. You're making us all look bad." Other staff members nodded in agreement, their faces showing a mix of concern and frustration. Jessica's hands trembled as she carried plates to her tables. Customer interactions became tense, with some openly filming her on their phones, hoping to catch another incident. The local news had run a story about the racist incident at Carter's family restaurant, though they hadn't named her directly. Tom spent more time in his office than usual, fielding calls from concerned customers and community members. The incident had forced him to confront his own management style. Had he been too passive about addressing bias in the workplace? He reviewed years of hiring decisions and customer complaints with new eyes. During a quiet moment, Tom called Jessica into his office. "I've been thinking," he said, straightening papers on his desk. "Maybe we both need to be part of the solution here. The Carters invited me to help with their exhibition planning. Would you consider joining?" The planning meetings for the exhibition took place after hours in the restaurant's private dining room. Tom felt out of place among the artists and community activists, but he listened intently as they discussed how to present difficult topics in accessible ways. David noticed Tom's discomfort, but appreciated his presence. "It's important to have different perspectives," he told the group. "Even uncomfortable ones. Especially uncomfortable ones." The community's response grew more polarized. Local business owners worried the exhibition would hurt tourism. Some threatened to boycott the restaurant. Others praised the Carters for tackling difficult issues head-on. Anonymous comments appeared on the restaurant's social media pages, some defending Jessica as a victim of cancel culture, others demanding her termination. The conversation had moved far beyond a simple accident with a bus bin. During one planning session, a prominent local business owner burst in uninvited. "You're going to destroy this neighborhood's reputation," he shouted. "We've worked hard to maintain our image." Tom stood up, surprising himself and others. "Maybe that image needs examining," he said, his voice steady. "I've managed this place for 15 years, and I'm just now realizing how much I've overlooked." The confrontation made local news, further dividing the community. Some praised Tom's stance, while others saw it as betrayal of long-standing community values. Jessica watched from the sidelines as the controversy grew. Her simple mistake had become a symbol for larger issues. Some wanted to make her a scapegoat, others a martyr. She felt lost between these extremes, unsure of her place in the unfolding drama. The pressure began affecting business. Some regular customers stopped coming, while new ones arrived, specifically to support the Carter's vision. The restaurant became a battleground for competing worldviews. Tom implemented new training programs focused on cultural sensitivity, despite pushback from some staff members. He scheduled discussions about bias in customer service, making attendance mandatory. The exhibition planning continued, gaining momentum despite the opposition. Tom found himself increasingly invested, contributing ideas about how to incorporate the restaurant industry's history of discrimination into the narrative. Jessica stood at the Carter's front door, her hand hovering over the doorbell. She'd searched online for their address and driven across town, determined to have a real conversation outside the charged atmosphere of the restaurant. Mia answered the door, paintbrush in hand and specks of blue paint on her cheek. Her initial surprise gave way to a welcoming gesture. "Come in," she said. "We were just talking about you." The Carter home reflected their commitment to art and culture. African masks hung alongside contemporary paintings. Family photos showed generations of struggle and triumph. David sat in the living room, reviewing exhibition plans. "I came to apologize properly," Jessica started, standing awkwardly in the center of the room, "and to listen. I've been doing a lot of reading, but I know that's not enough." David set aside his papers. "Tell me, Jessica, before the incident, had you ever really thought about what it means to be Black in this community?" The conversation lasted hours. The Carters shared stories. David being followed by security guards in his own office building, Mia's art being rejected from galleries for being too ethnic, Mrs. Carter being mistaken for household help at community functions. "The garbage wasn't just garbage that day," David explained. "It carried the weight of every slight, every assumption, every door closed in our faces." Jessica listened, tears streaming down her face. "I never knew. I knew racism existed, but I didn't understand how it affects every moment of every day." Mia brought out her sketchbook, showing Jessica the artwork inspired by their experience. "See how this piece shows hands reaching across a divide? That's what's happening right now in this room." Mrs. Carter joined them, bringing tea and adding her own stories. She described the challenges they faced buying the restaurant, the subtle resistance from banks, the whispered concerns about changing the neighborhood's character. "But we're not angry at you, Jessica," Mrs. Carter said. "Your accident opened a door we needed to walk through. Sometimes it takes a dramatic moment to start an important conversation." Jessica shared her own story, growing up in a mostly white neighborhood, never questioning her assumptions, taking her privileges for granted. The Carters listened without judgment, creating a space for honest dialogue. As evening approached, the conversation shifted to action. "Would you be willing to share your story at the exhibition?" Mia asked. "Your journey of understanding could help others see their own biases." The connection forming between Jessica and the Carters represented something larger than themselves. It was a small example of what could happen when people move past their initial reactions to find common ground. Before leaving, Jessica studied one of Mia's paintings, a powerful image of hands dropping garbage that transformed into butterflies. "It's about transformation," Mia explained. "How mistakes can lead to beauty if we're brave enough to learn from them." The visit marked a turning point. Jessica left with a deeper understanding of her role in the community's transformation. The Carters watched her drive away, recognizing that their response to the incident had created an unexpected opportunity for healing. The exhibition's opening night loomed 1 week away. The restaurant's private dining room transformed into a makeshift command center, filled with art installations, lighting equipment, and mounting supplies. Mia directed volunteers while David handled logistics and security concerns. Local media interest intensified. Some outlets portrayed the exhibition as a brave step toward addressing systemic racism, others as a publicity stunt threatening community harmony. Police advised increasing security after online threats appeared targeting the event. Jessica and the Carters worked side by side, preparing placards that would accompany each artwork. Her story featured prominently in the exhibition's narrative arc, from the incident to her journey of understanding. The process brought her closer to the family, though some community members viewed this development with suspicion. During a final run-through, Harold Matthews, a prominent real estate developer, entered uninvited. He stood before Mia's central piece, the Garbage to Butterflies transformation, his face twisted in disapproval. "This will hurt property values," Matthews declared loudly. "You're painting our community as racist for publicity. This isn't art, it's propaganda." David stepped forward, maintaining composure. "Mr. Matthews, this exhibition shows both problems and solutions. If you take time to understand understand what? That you're using an accident to push your agenda?" Matthews gestured toward Jessica. "Even she knows it wasn't about race. Right, Jessica?" Jessica felt all eyes turned to her. The old Jessica might have stayed silent, avoiding conflict. Instead, she spoke firmly. "It wasn't intentional, but my actions existed within a larger context of bias and privilege. I understand that now." Matthews scoffed, pulling out his phone. "Wait until the neighborhood association hears about this. You're making a mistake that will cost all of us." Mia intervened, offering to walk Matthews through the exhibition. "Let me show you the hope in these pieces, not just the criticism." Her calm approach temporarily defused the situation, though Matthews left making vague threats about community boycotts. The confrontation shook the preparation team. Tom, who witnessed the exchange, started implementing additional security measures. He hired professional security guards and installed extra cameras, using his own savings to cover costs the restaurant's budget couldn't absorb. David gathered everyone after Matthews left. "This reaction proves why we need this exhibition. Fear of honest dialogue perpetuates the problem. We move forward as planned." The team worked late into the night, fine-tuning lighting, adjusting artwork placement, and rehearsing the opening presentation. Jessica practiced her speech about personal growth and unconscious bias, her hands shaking less with each run-through. Social media buzzed with competing hashtags. Hashtag Boycott Carter Restaurant and hashtag Support Carter Change trended locally. The exhibition became a lightning rod for broader discussions about race in the community. Opening night arrived with a mix of tension and anticipation. The exhibition space buzzed with energy as people filed in. Supporters, critics, media, and curious community members. Security guards positioned themselves discreetly at key points. Art filled the transformed restaurant space. Mia's paintings lined the walls, interspersed with interactive installations. One station invited visitors to write anonymous confessions of their own biases. Another displayed statistics about discrimination in the service industry. Jessica stationed herself near her contributed piece, a multimedia installation combining security footage of the incident with her recorded reflections on personal growth. She wore her waitress uniform, a deliberate choice to own her role in the story. The crowd grew larger than expected. Local civil rights leaders mingled with restaurant regulars. Teachers brought students. Even some initial critics attended, though they clustered together, whispering their disapproval. David stepped to the mic-crop, honed for the opening speech. "Welcome to Transforming Tables, a journey from bias to understanding. What began as an unfortunate incident has become an opportunity for community dialogue." As he spoke, a commotion erupted near the entrance. A group of protesters pushed past security, carrying signs, "Stop race baiting and support local values." "This is a restaurant, Not a propaganda center, one protester shouted. Others joined in, their voices drowning out David's speech. The security team moved to intervene, but tension filled the air. Some exhibition attendees began arguing with protesters. Phones emerged to record the confrontation. Jessica watched her installation's video play on loop, the moment of the spill repeating while her voice spoke about learning and change. The contrast between that moment and the current chaos struck her deeply. Mia grabbed the microphone. This reaction proves exactly why we need this conversation. Look around you. Every piece here tells a story of real experiences, real pain, and real hope for change. The protesters continued their disruption, but something unexpected happened. Some attendees began engaging them in conversation, pointing to specific artworks, sharing personal stories. Jessica stepped forward to deliver her prepared speech, her voice shaking but determined. A month ago, I was just a waitress who made a mistake. Now I understand that mistake was part of a larger pattern, one we can change if we're willing to learn. Her words caught the attention of both supporters and protesters. The sincerity in her voice cut through the chaos. She described her journey from defensive denial to understanding, from shame to growth. The evening teetered between breakthrough and breakdown. Media cameras captured everything: the art, the protests, the conversations, the confrontations. The story was no longer just local. Regional news outlets picked it up. As the night progressed, small groups formed throughout the space. Despite the initial disruption, real dialogues emerged. People shared experiences, challenged assumptions, asked difficult questions. Tom observed from near the kitchen, noting how his regular customers reacted to the exhibition. Some left angry, others stayed engaged in deep conversation. The restaurant was transforming before his eyes from a simple eating establishment to a catalyst for change. Chaos erupted in the exhibition space. The protesters grew more aggressive, pushing past the artwork to confront attendees directly. Several of Mia's paintings swayed precariously on their mounts as people bumped against walls. "This is what happens when you stir up trouble," shouted one protester, pointing accusingly at David. The man's face was red with anger, veins visible on his neck. David stood his ground, maintaining composure. If expressing truth is stirring up trouble, then maybe trouble needs stirring. His voice carried across the room, steady and clear. Security guards positioned themselves between the opposing groups, but the space was too crowded for effective crowd control. Tom rushed to protect the restaurant's property, standing in front of the most valuable equipment. Mia worked quickly to secure her artwork, enlisting volunteers to help move the most vulnerable pieces to safety. Her hands trembled as she carefully detached her centerpiece, the Garbage to Butterflies transformation painting. Through the chaos, Mia noticed something striking. Her art was speaking louder than the shouting. Even as some protesters yelled, others stopped to actually look at the pieces. The images of everyday discrimination resonated, causing visible discomfort in some faces. Jessica pushed through her fear and stepped up to the microphone, her waitress uniform a stark visual reminder of where this journey began. "Please," she called out, her voice cracking but gaining strength. "Look at what we've created here. Look at how a mistake became an opportunity." The crowd's attention shifted. Here was the white waitress who'd sparked the controversy, not defending herself, but advocating for understanding. Some protesters lowered their signs, confused by this unexpected development. "I could have hidden after what happened," Jessica continued. "Instead, I chose to learn. These artworks show stories that have always existed in our community. We just weren't looking." As she spoke, David and Mia positioned themselves beside her. The visual of the three of them together, the waitress who'd made the mistake, the black business owner who'd chosen education over retaliation, and the artist who'd transformed their story, created a powerful image. The tension in the room began to shift. Some protesters moved closer, their aggressive stance softening as they examined the artwork more carefully. One man, still holding his protest sign, stood transfixed before a painting showing a black child being pulled from a swimming pool. "That happened to my grandson," a voice called out from the crowd. An elderly black woman stepped forward. "At the community pool, just last summer, These paintings aren't propaganda. They're our lives. The protest leaders tried to maintain momentum, but their followers began to scatter, some engaging in quiet conversations with exhibition attendees, others simply observing the art in thoughtful silence. The exhibition's peak tension moment arrived when a protester rushed toward David, finger pointed accusingly. Jessica stepped between them, her stance firm but non-threatening. "Before you say anything else," Jessica spoke clearly, "look at that painting behind you. Really look at it. That could have been me, the one causing pain, staying ignorant, choosing not to understand." The protester hesitated, turning to see Mia's artwork depicting everyday microaggressions. A security guard following a black shopper, a woman clutching her purse when a black man enters an elevator, a waitress avoiding serving certain tables. More protesters began engaging with the artwork, their angry energy dissipating into uncomfortable recognition. One man lowered his sign, studying a piece showing a job interview scene where qualified black candidates were repeatedly overlooked. "This happened to me," he admitted quietly. "I was on the other side, though. I was the interviewer who always found reasons not to hire certain people. I never thought of it as racism, but looking at this," a small group formed around him as he shared his realization. Others began opening up about their own experiences, both as perpetrators and victims of discrimination. The protesters' ringleader made one last attempt to rally his group. "They're trying to make us feel guilty for things we didn't do." But his words fell flat as more people engaged in genuine dialogue. One of the younger protesters, a college student, approached Mia. "I came here angry because I thought you were attacking our community. But these paintings, they're not attacking, are they? They're just showing what's already here." The atmosphere shifted from confrontational to contemplative. Small discussion groups formed throughout the space, with people from opposing sides actually listening to each other. An older man who'd been vocally against the exhibition earlier in the evening found himself in conversation with Mrs. Carter. "My grandchildren are growing up in a different world," he said. "Maybe it's time I try to understand it better." The transformation wasn't universal. Some protesters left angry, promising consequences. But others stayed, engaged in difficult but necessary conversations about privilege, bias, and community responsibility. The exhibition space, which minutes earlier had felt like a battlefield, became a forum for honest dialogue. People shared stories they'd never told before, admitted to biases they'd never examined, and began to see their community through new eyes. Jessica's position at the center of this transformation gave others permission to acknowledge their own growth. Her journey from accidental offender to active ally demonstrated the possibility of change. The evening ended not with a clear victory for either side, but with a sense that something had shifted in the community's consciousness. The art had done its job, not by forcing agreement, but by creating space for authentic dialogue. The aftermath of the exhibition brought unexpected revelations. Anonymous sources provided evidence that Richard Sterling, a senior member of the Neighborhood Association's board, had orchestrated the protests. Email showed him actively recruiting protesters and crafting inflammatory messages about the exhibition. David and Mia discovered Sterling had financial interests in maintaining the area's traditional character. His real estate company specialized in marketing the neighborhood as an exclusive community. The exhibition and the Carter's ownership of a prominent restaurant threatened his carefully crafted narrative. During an emergency community meeting, Jessica presented printed copies of Sterling's emails. The same man who claimed we were dividing the community was actively working to create that division, she announced to the packed room. Sterling sat in the back, his face rigid as David took the podium. "We bought this restaurant believing in its potential to bring people together." Mr. Sterling saw that as a threat to his business model. The evidence was damning. Sterling had written about maintaining property values and preserving neighborhood character, coded language that the community now recognized for what it was. "I was protecting our community's interests," Sterling defended himself, standing to address the crowd. But his usual supporters remained silent, many having attended the exhibition and experienced their own transformations. Mia presented additional findings. Years of Sterling's influence in blocking minority-owned businesses from opening in the neighborhood, manipulating zoning meetings, and spreading fears about changing demographics. The meeting reached its climax when several longtime residents spoke up. They shared stories of being pressured by Sterling's company to sell their homes below market value, followed by high markup sales to preferred buyers. Sterling resigned from the board that evening, his carefully constructed influence crumbling. The community began examining other decisions he'd influenced over the years. Jessica found herself celebrated not just for growth and learning, but for courage in standing against intimidation. The Carter family officially hired her as their community outreach coordinator for the restaurant. The exhibition became a permanent installation in the restaurant's private dining room, available for educational groups and community discussions. Local schools incorporated visits into their curriculum. Tom implemented new hiring practices, actively working to diversify his staff. The restaurant's culture transformed, becoming known for both its food and its commitment to inclusion. The final scene played out as Sterling cleared out his office. Through the window, he watched as Jessica and the Carters hosted a community dinner, the restaurant filled with faces of all colors, the conversations flowing freely, and the garbage incident that started it all now immortalized in art and memory as a catalyst for genuine change.